After the feeble resistance at Lexington, Colonel Smith expected that their mission would be accomplished quickly, and they would be able to return to Boston before evening. They seized the North Bridge, searched the Barrett farm in Concord for weapons without resistance for almost 4 hours. Finding very little, they felt their mission was over. But then things got complicated.
The combined British force of some 700 to 800 officers and men approached Concord an hour and a half later in the early morning. Colonel Smith ordered several companies, or about 220 troops, to secure the North Bridge across the Concord River, and then a portion of the men continued another mile to the Barrett farm, where they suspected that there was a cache of arms and powder. However, the Colonials had hidden most of the stores 3 nights before, after being warned by Paul Revere. Samuel Prescott, who had slipped away from the patrol near Lexington, had warned Concord and Acton militias some 2 or 3 hours beforehand, and by the time that the British arrived, they were met by hundreds of militiamen. The Concord militia was led by 65-year-old Colonel James Barrett, who assumed command of his militia troop and those from Acton and other surrounding towns. After becoming aware of the size of British Colonel Smith's command, he withdrew his force of some 400 men over the bridge to a hill that overlooked the North Bridge to await for reinforcements. Over the next 3 hours, the British fruitlessly searched the town for arms. During that time, the Americans could only hear the British troops take over their town, seizing weapons and gunpowder. But by that time, the militia numbers had increased to over 2,000 men. The militia became alarmed when they saw billows of smoke rising up above Concord. The smoke resulted from the British burning a few supplies in Cannon Carriagee, and unintentionally, the fire spread to the meeting house, at which point the British officers and troops helped the Colonials to put the fire out. Thinking that the town and their homes were being put to the torch, Lieutenant Joseph Hosmore of Concord shouted to his fellow officers,
"Will you let them burn the town down?"
On that note, Colonel Barrett ordered the combined militias to advance toward the Redcoats, who were guarding the North Bridge. But Barrett ordered them not to fire unless they were fired upon first. 30-year-old Captain Isaac Davis commanded the Acton Company, which was placed at the head of the column. When asked if they were prepared to confront the British troops, Davis said,
"I haven't a man afraid to go."
As they formed ranks and marched down the hill, the 95 British soldiers who had been left to protect the bridge became frightened by the increased Colonial numbers and their orderly advance down the hill. They retreated across the bridge to the opposite shore and prepared to defend themselves. A redcoat officer began to remove planks from the bridge in order to slow down the Americans' advance, which only made the militia angry. When Davis's company came within 150 feet of the bridge, the British soldiers opened fire, killing both Captain Isaac Davis and Lieutenant Abner Hosmer. But this time, the colonists did not run. They kept on coming. Major Buttrick of the Concord militia shouted,
"For God's sake, fire!"
And the Minutemen replied with their own volley, killing 3 British soldiers and wounding 9 others. This volley from the Colonial militia marked the beginning of the Revolution. With that, the British troops hastily retreated back toward Concord. Colonel Smith, upon hearing the exchange of gunfire, marched his men toward the bridge, where there was a tense standoff with the militia before the British withdrew from Concord and began their long march back to Boston. That interchange allowed the arrival of more American reinforcements, which put additional pressure on the British to withdraw and turned into a fighting retreat. Smith's force was repeatedly ambushed and sniped at from behind trees and rock walls and buildings as it withdrew along the road through Lexington and on to Boston. Several officers were killed or wounded as Smith struggled to maintain control. His men lost discipline and single-mindedly hurried onward in a general retreat. By the time the force traveled the 6 miles to Lexington, the column was near collapse. But to their great relief, a brigade of British reinforcements under Brigadier General Hugh Percy was waiting there. After dispersing the pursuing militia with artillery, Percy covered Colonel Smith's retreat back to Boston. During the journey, the colonial militia reformed and repeatedly fired upon the combined force of 1,700 troops. But Percy's well-planned defensive formations fought them off. Many of the British had not slept for 2 days and had marched 40 miles in 21 hours, much of it under fire. The casualties sustained during the retreat from an often unseen enemy, along with the alleged scalping of one redcoat, led the British soldiers to commit atrocities against the locals along the way. During the retreat, the British lost 73 killed, 173 wounded, and 26 missing, while at the same time the American losses were only 50 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. Lexington was not a serious military defeat for the British, but it was politically disastrous. Smith's expedition managed to seize a few weapons, but it caused the very fighting it was intended to prevent. It was here that the violence turned a colonial revolt against the British policy into a fight for political independence. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord led many Americans who had wavered beforehand to support the Revolution. For John Adams, these battles were the moment that the die was cast, that the Rubicon was crossed. They also showed that American citizen soldiers could stand up to redcoats, something previously doubted by many on both sides. Within 2 days of the British returning to Boston, 15,000 men from across New England had assembled and surrounded the British in Boston. All of these events took place in late April of 1775. At the time, I was at home in Virginia, dealing with my personal responsibilities and preparing to travel to Philadelphia in late May for the Second Continental Congress. I had no idea that by mid-July that I would be in Boston myself, leading thousands of colonists against a huge British army and naval force.
It shouldn't have happened this way, but it did, to everybody's shock. The fire had gotten out of control and spread to the Concord meeting house. The result was that much more than the meeting hall was set on fire. Blood had been spilled at Lexington, and militias from the surrounding countryside had assembled at Concord. Now the town and homes were being burned. Would the British stop at nothing? Who would stand up against them?